We'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which this podcast was produced, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to elders past and present.
It's Saturday, the 23rd of June 2018. We're in Thailand's northernmost province, just on the border of Laos and Myanmar. The local youth soccer team, 12 boys aged 11 to 16, and their coach are heading into a local cave. It's a system some of them have been in before, a snaking passage of caverns and crevasses. They're heading in as part of a sort of initiation ceremony to see how far they can get in the labyrinth of tunnels that run deep beneath the ground. But soon after they enter, heavy rainfall floods the caves and the entire team are stuck almost a kilometre below the surface. It's 9 days before anyone knows they're there, with little food and barely any light, huddled together on a patch of mud surrounded by water. When the news reaches Richard Harry Harris back in Australia, he knows he's one of the few people with the skills to get them out. I'm at Middleton, this is Headgame. My guest today is the Australian deep diving anaesthetist who was instrumental in 2018's Thai cave rescue. Richard Harris, thanks for joining me, mate.
Thank you, Ant. I'm a bit of a fan of yours, so it was quite an exciting opportunity to be able to come and have a chat.
Yeah, vice versa, mate, vice versa. And I want to get straight into things, I want to get straight into the rescue. But before we do, just give me an insight into your career.
Yeah, well, I guess my life has had two main parts. One has been diving since I was a little boy, as young as I can remember, really grew up, in the water and did my diving course at the age of about 15. And it's really been a huge passion of mine ever since, and cave diving for a very large part of that. And exploring and making images of underwater caves all around the world. So that's been my big passion. That didn't pay the rent, so I had to get a real job. So off to medical school, and I became an anaesthetist, and working a lot outside the operating theatre as well. So, I've always been looking for a bit of adventure in my life, whether it's at work or in my recreation. And for me, in medicine, being an anaesthetist gave me great opportunities to work in different environments. So I spent a fair bit of time in developing countries, places like Vanuatu in the Pacific, and also working in the aeromedical retrieval space, doing aeromedical work, so flying around the state of South Australia, picking up people with critical injuries and illnesses. And there was a bit of an overlap with the cave diving because I started to develop a cave rescue capability in Australia and New Zealand, because I thought of people like myself and my friend Craig, who I know you know. Yeah. We have been caving in some very remote locations, and I often wondered what would happen to us if we got injured in part of a cave where we had to be extricated through a sump through a flooded section of the cave. So we started practicing and rehearsing for that. And of course, when this thing in Thailand came up, Craig and I were both very, very keen to get involved. And it was the marrying of these two lifelong passions.
So talk me through the moment you get that call.
Well, the call was actually a long time coming, because I've been following the rescue right from day one when these kids got themselves stuck in the cave, and I knew quite a few of the people who were involved. There was some European divers, expats living in Thailand who I knew from exploring caves in Thailand myself, and so I'd been in touch with those guys, and they were saying, the situation looks pretty hopeless, to be honest. There's no real chance of these kids coming out alive, in their opinion, if they are still alive after the initial flooding event. And then some British mates got involved, Rick Stanton and John Valanthan, who became very famous really when they actually found these kids. And so I was in touch with Rick. And about 3 days after Rick and John located the children, I had been pestering him, as I'd been pestering everyone, to try and get myself over there. And he came up with this idea of sedating the children, and being an anaesthetist, he thought that I could be the one to do that. And so that's the moment where we actually got a formal invite. And actually Craig and I were about to head out to the Nullarbor Plain the very next day. And we would have been off grid by then, and we had really decided that, look, they just don't need us over there. There's plenty of divers. And it was this sedation idea of Rick's that really got us the invite. And so that same day we were on a plane to Bangkok and then up to Chiang Rai.
Wow. So you being an anaesthetist and a rescue diver, a cave rescue diver, talk about two completely separate sort of entities. You would never imagine that the two would marry together. That's what got you the call to come out. So you jump on a plane. What's the first thing that happens when you hit the ground?
Yeah, well, in my work with the ambulance, I'd been to some mass casualty incidents and seen, massing of emergency services and those sort of personnel, but I'd never seen anything on this scale. I mean, we were told that by the end of the rescue, there were upwards of 10,000 people in or around that mountain. And so when Craig got a bit delayed, actually missed one of his flights, and so I arrived there a couple of hours early, and I remember getting out of this van, being greeted by, firstly, an ocean of mud and rain. I mean, it was full-on monsoon by then, and it was just a quagmire. And thousands of people in uniform of all different kinds and nationalities everywhere. And it just seemed to be chaos, as these big scenes often are. And I think at that stage it was still quite chaotic. There was an element of order to it, as you would know from these sort of incidents, but order was still being established. And I think the Americans actually played an important role in bringing order to that chaos. I think, the might of that military is so good at coming into major situations and areas of chaos and bringing order to that kind of scene. So I was quite impressed with the role they played in kind of bringing people to the table and helping decisions being made. But anyway, for my own part, I just had to make sense of this thing. So I asked to be taken to where the British cave divers were camped, and sort of finding your own tribe in the middle of that mayhem I found very comforting, and start to talk to those guys about the cave itself, because, it's drummed into us in the emergency services. Your first responsibility is to your own safety, and, there's no one benefits if you become a liability or if you're not up to the job. And so I needed
Casualty.
to talk to, I needed to talk to Rick and say, look, what's the cave like? Like, will I be able to get myself to the end of it? I mean, those guys are such outstanding and experienced cave divers. When a mere mortal cave diver like myself and Craig, rock up, the first thing I want to know is that are we going to be all right in the cave itself before I can think about anything?
So you arrive with this chaos, and the Americans take the command and control. And I can imagine you've got military, you've got emergency services, you've got security services, you've got multiple nationalities, you've got the families, you've got the press. I can imagine the press were there, quite in numbers. And like you said, you get a little bit of comfort or safety of just going into your little known space, your little comfort bubble, which is your own people, which is your cave divers, to really focus on the task at hand, because ultimately your job is just to find out what these caves are like, how you can get to the boys, and ultimately how you can conduct a rescue. So was your idea, was the game plan to stay isolated with these people so you can just get your head in the game and try and ignore everything that was going on around you?
Yeah, I think so. And to be honest, we wouldn't have known where to start in terms of getting to the leadership area because it was madness. And so I had the Australian Federal Police there. They had some operators from the AFP there who were kind of looking after us a bit, and also, strong lads. They were carrying some gear in and out of the cave, which was nice. We had the people from the Australian government there, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, who were sort of acting as liaison for us with the Thai government. So we could really just concentrate on our part of this huge plan. And the first thing was that Craig and I just needed to dive the cave, and a fair bit of diving had been done by this stage, and Rick and John had actually found the boys 3 days earlier. So this is nearly 2 weeks into the disappearance of these kids. Wow. We were pretty late on the scene, and Rick and John had been there for about 10 days. And so it was 9 days in total that these kids spent in the cave, completely isolated, no food, dwindling light sources, and the cave starting to actively flood in front of their eyes. They went from being trapped by water to being threatened by the amount of water that was flowing through the cave.
Wow, so whilst they were there, it was slowly filling up still.
Yeah, absolutely. After about 3 days, suddenly there was something must have broken through a a dam or a coffer or something, because suddenly a torrent of water came rushing down the passage. And they were very lucky at that moment because they were in a part of the cave where the only bit of high ground in the entire 10 kilometres of tunnel in there was. And so they managed to sprint up this hill about 10 metres high and sit on a flat, muddy platform just big enough for the 13 of them. And that's where they remained until they were rescued.
And when's the first time that you set your eyes on the boys, and what was the dive like?
It's not a cave that you would normally dive in for fun, a cave that is actively flooding. 12 months worth of mud and dirt and grot being flushed out of the cave meant the visibility was literally zero in the water. There's no point even opening your eyes half the time. You just couldn't see anything. And
Wow.
So it was 2.4 kilometres from the entrance to where the boys were. And that was divided into about 8 sumps, 8 diving sections. And in between each one, there was basically a river passage with an airspace above it. So you would dive through a section of cave, and we wear our tanks, cylinders on our sides to make us more streamlined so that we can go through what we call flatteners, so areas that are, maybe quite wide but fairly low, so you can just sort of wriggle through with your back and your front touching the rock or the mud. And then, progress through, and then you'd get up into an air chamber and you'd take your cylinders off, you'd carry, wade or swim them up the next section of the river, and then put them back underwater again, and on you'd go, repeat that. And it took about 3 hours, I would say, to get from chamber 3, which is where the diving started in earnest, up to where the boys were. So 3 hours of sort of battling up the river. So it was a pretty solid day out to go up there and back.
How do you have enough cylinders or oxygen to do 3? Obviously, you have to calm your breathing down.
Yeah,
really...
you have to obviously be very aware of not using too much of your breathing gas, because you've got to come out and have enough margin for safety as well in case you get lost or turned around or stuck somewhere. So we use this rule of thirds, where you use a third of your air to go in, a third to come out, and leave a third for an emergency. And actually 2 full cylinders was enough for that, because it's very, very shallow. The cave was only about 4 metres deep for most part. So you don't use much air in those depths. And, we would stop breathing off the tanks at every opportunity when we're in the air passages. And when you're in the flow, going into the cave, we'd pull ourselves along the climbing rope that had been laid by the other divers along the way. And actually using your arms is quite efficient. You can, if you don't kick with your big leg muscles, you don't use so much gas. So yeah, not too bad. And we had enough gas to safely get up and down the cave. But it was hard cave diving. There were often very tight restrictions, which you had to feel around in the dark to find a hole that you could fit through, and follow the rope and keep your hand on that lifeline at all times, obviously, because if you lose that, you're certainly in trouble.
How much do you have to really calm yourself down? How much of a mind game is it to get through something like that?
Yeah, cave diving is very much a mental sport. It's not that physical once you're in the water. Pulling your gear and climbing through caves is very hard work, but underwater it's usually pretty relaxed and cruisy. So it's very much a cerebral thing, and you get used to it through incremental exposure and repetition, and it becomes a place for us that we love being in. And to be honest, a lot of people have said to us, "Oh, you're very brave to dive in that cave and do what you do," but of course, for us, that's what we do on the weekends. That's what we.
That was your hobby. That was your passion.
Yeah. So I never really felt like my life was in danger in that cave. Although you wouldn't choose to dive in an actively flooding cave, but apart from that, it never felt like it was a life-threatening thing. For me, it was always about the moral dilemma about what to do for these boys. That was what was scaring the crap out of me.
So when you reached the boys, what was your first initial thought? Were you emotional? Were you shocked? What went through your head?
Look, I was professional because I knew that these kids were relying on us, but I was shocked and emotional on the inside. It was, this moment where this hypothetical idea that I'd been living with for a couple of weeks and actually pushing to get involved with, suddenly this is the reality. And, up until then it had been an interesting adventure, an exercise in logistics and planning, which I really enjoy. And then, okay, these are human boys and human beings and little boys, and they're sweet kids, they're so calm, so courageous, composed. I don't know, that moment that I actually met those kids was when my resolve to do something was absolutely increased. I knew there was no way I was leaving Thailand without those kids coming out. And, in those moments you make some maybe fairly rash promises and, basically said to these kids, we'll be back tomorrow to get you out,
Yeah, hope. Of course you do. And it must be phenomenal pressure. And, the emotion behind that, again, like you said about promising, you do that. The hope is, right, I need to get these boys out. That came the sole purpose thereafter, was it? As soon as you set eyes on them, it's like, right, this is about getting these boys out alive.
Yeah, and boy, there's nothing more motivating than, realising that you're looking at 13 young people who are essentially still dead men walking. I mean, there was no way that they were coming out alive. And, the reason I'd been asked to go there was to consider this plan to anaesthetise them, to bring them out. And I was still 100% convinced, for a whole heap of reasons, that could not possibly work, that would end in the death of every single one of those boys.
Oh, so you were against that when they said, right, we're going to anaesthetise the boys, bring them out, and you were like, no way. When did the penny drop? When did you think, well, actually, this is probably the only option that we have?
I think I was either subconsciously blocking out that idea that everyone was watching, or I was oblivious to it. I can't even really remember the truth of that now, to be honest. But I didn't feel that pressure of the whole global, media.
You're so focused.
Yeah, I just, for some reason, that wasn't part of the equation for me. It was just about, what is the best thing here? And having seen the kids, seen the squalor that they were living in there, because remember, they've been in there for now 12 days or so, and 4 Navy SEALs have gone in to join them. 2 were supposed to stay, and 2 got stuck with them because they all ran out of air going in there. So we've now got 4 adults kind of trapped in there with them, also consuming the resources that's in there. So the Brits have been taking food in for the boys and for the Navy SEALs. So of course the products of eating food were now contributing to the smell and the deteriorating environment in there. So infection was becoming a real strong possibility. And the water quality was deteriorating because of that. So it was only a matter of time before they all started getting gastro and getting really crook. So when I left those boys that day, I knew that basically I had 2 options. And one was to get on a plane to go back to Adelaide and leave them to die of exposure and infection or whatever, which might take weeks. Or we had to try this anaesthetic plan, because I'd had time to look at all the other plans that were in place, and I realised that not one of them had any chance of possibly working. And there were many, many other plans on the table. Lots of crazy stuff, including, Elon's submarine and, waiting till the end of the monsoon and trying to put enough food and water and stuff in there to keep the kids alive, trying to teach them to dive, which, to teach them to a level equivalent to ours in 1 or 2 days is impossible. They would definitely panic if you tried to bring them out anything less than fully anaesthetised. So it sort of came to me that either I do this or I walk away. And as I mentioned, now that I'd seen these boys, walking away just wasn't an option. So what are you going to do? You have to give something a try. And at the very least, we'll bring the bodies of those boys out to their parents, and that's better than the alternative. But, it's not a great justification for a plan, I have to say.
In your head, how risky was anaesthetising the boys and diving with them?
Well, I felt that I was the best informed diver there about the risks. For a lay person who hasn't sort of thought through all the implications of what we're proposing, you think, oh, well, if they're asleep and you've got a full face mask on, so you've got their airway sealed against the water, they can probably, survive if they're just asleep and quiet for 3 hours out through this water. But, I could think of several reasons why they would perish. One being that, having used those full face masks myself quite a bit, in fact, having trained with them in our cave diving rescue scenarios, and on one occasion pretending to be unconscious myself and having people push me around underground through a cave, I found that the water would slowly fill up the mask. And, inevitably over 3 hours, I thought surely these kids would die. And, not just that, but these kids were tiny. The smallest one was 29 kilos. So getting these commercial diving masks to fit these tiny little boys was not that straightforward. I thought, if their airway, if their head just tilts forward a bit, they'll lose their airway, they'll die of hypothermia. There were so many reasons I could see that they could die. So I went into this plan really telling myself, I'm probably euthanizing these kids, and that's how I felt about it as we started.
How did that sit with you, knowing coming from a medical background? Did you envision that there would be some deaths? Yeah,
I remember saying to the British divers, whatever happens, just you have to keep moving towards the exit of the cave. It's highly likely some of these kids, and in my mind it was probably all of them, highly likely some of these kids will drown on the way out, but there's nothing we can do for them underwater. There's no underwater CPR or resuscitation. You just got to keep going. And we've got to get these boys back to their parents one way or another. So, to me, being a fairly pragmatic kind of person, I just felt that, if that was my kid, I'd rather have him back now than get his skeleton out in 6 months' time, and knowing that he's died a horrible, horrible death. It seemed like an easy choice, even though it was desperately awful.
It sounded like it was the only choice. So do you remember sitting down and actually making the decision with the team to go with this? Because there's loads of implications with this, right? You've got to make sure you've got the right dosage, that they don't wake up underwater, that there's enough space to move with an extra body on you, how you're going to move with them, where do you put them, that the masks don't leak, that, if you were to put that on the table and go, what's the likelihood of achieving this mission, it would probably be like, 1 or 2%. Do you remember having that conversation to give it the green light and go, right, listen, let's do this?
As a group, the group of cave divers were pretty autonomous. We were left to our own devices to really work this through and then present it as a plan to the leadership. And so whilst Craig and I were diving through the cave, checking out the cave for ourselves, and I was checking out the boys from both a medical point of view and to convince myself, what way forward I needed to go, the British divers and the pararescue team from the US Air Force were down at the pool with some volunteer kids from the local swimming club and just playing around with all the equipment, dressing them up in a way that might work if we went ahead with this. So by the time we all came back together that night, the practicalities of the plan had kind of been sorted out by the Brits and the Americans, and the anaesthetic plan, if you like, had been clarified in my head. So we all came together and learnt from each other the different bits of the puzzle. And I remember basically giving my anaesthesia lecture for about 20 minutes to all the cave divers and explaining to them how the dosage would work, what their role was going to be, how they would need to administer further top-ups of the drug on the way out, because this was a 3-hour trip and we were proposing to use ketamine, which you'd be well familiar with as a kind of tactical, field anaesthetic and painkiller. And so I was going to anaesthetise the boys with an injection through their wetsuit into their thigh muscle. And then the British guys, who were going to take 1 boy each out per day, so 4 kids per day, would have to top up their boy with anaesthetic probably about every 3/4 of an hour.
Wow. So to find an air pocket as such along the way, and again, having broken the cave down into 8 segments, like you said, it's about reaching one of those air pockets in time, right?
Yeah. And the longest dive actually was probably the first one. It was about 20 minutes duration, 300 metres. And so there was plenty of opportunities along the way. And we had all the other divers like Craig and these other European guys and some more British guys by then staggered along all those air chambers waiting to assist on the way past so that they could carry the British divers' gear across that section while he administered the anaesthetic if required. And most of those kids ended up getting 4 to 6 top-ups on the way out. So they became pretty adept anaesthetists by the end of it, which was good.
And how did you swim them? How did you attach a lifeless body to yourself? Know that the mask is not leaking because obviously you're in murky waters. You probably can't even see the child's mask. How do you put all of those into practice? How the hell did you do it?
Well, again, I think a little knowledge is good for these British guys because they didn't realise what it probably looks like for a normal anaesthetist to be in a well-illuminated operating theatre with all the monitors on and, to be able to see their patient, obviously, and all the rest of it. They were basically transporting a lifeless form tucked under their arm, one hand on the rope at all times so they didn't get lost as they navigated out of the passage. The other arm wrapped around the boy. And I only took one of the kids out the last part of the cave, but I can... it was good to have that experience because I guess now I know what they experienced. So having your hand around their chest or their belly, you could feel their respiration, so you knew that they were breathing properly. You could hear the bubbles coming from their face mask, and if you kept the kid's head tucked under your chin, you could actually feel those bubbles going past your face, so you knew they were breathing okay. You can hear by listening to their mask if there's any water gurgling around in there and that the airway is clear. So it's amazing how much you can pick up just from listening and feeling. And I don't know whether they appreciated, the other guys, how much information you can get in that way about an unconscious person. But I found it quite fascinating as well as quite terrifying.
All of your other senses take over.
Yeah.
You can't see, so touch, feel, just listening in underwater. Like you said, you can hear a hell of a lot underneath there.
Yeah, it was very interesting for me.
When you obviously brief the children up and the team, the coaches on what's their first reaction when you tell them that you're just were they just like, whatever, at this stage they're suffering, they're probably delusional, but having that conversation with them and administering the first lot of ketamine to the first child, how did that go down?
Yeah, well, that briefing to the kids and the coach was actually done the day before when we went in to see the kids, and I basically explained to them what the likely or one of the possible plans was the next day, this anaesthetic plan. And luckily one of the Navy SEALs spoke quite good English, and so I was getting him to translate for me. And I basically gave them a very nuts and bolts sort of list of information, said that tomorrow we'll come back, 4 of you will be dressed in wetsuits, one by one you'll come down and sit on my lap in the water. You'll get an injection in each thigh muscle and you'll go to sleep. We're going to dress you up in more diving equipment. When you wake up, you'll be outside the cave. That was it. And so I was watching the faces of these kids as this message was relayed. And honestly, they were totally unfazed by it. I didn't see a whimper. I didn't see a trembling lip.
It's making me tremble just hearing it. If you said that to me, I'd be like, what?
Craig actually put forward a good explanation of this to me. He said, when you think you're screwed and you 100% know that you're going to die, if someone reaches out with the hand of salvation, you just take it. You don't even question it. And I don't think they even maybe heard what I was saying. They just were going, we're leaving and we're in. It was interesting insight into people's mentality when they're in that sort of situation.
And how many, and probably a hard question for you, Harry, but in your mind, in your head, how successful did you think that this operation would be?
Well, we sent 4 boys anaesthetised out that first day, and then I had to swim out by myself, at the end of the day to find out if any of them had survived. And I was absolutely sure in my mind that I was going to be greeted with the news that 4 out of 4 had died when I got out there. And when I reached chamber 3, which was the end of the diving operations, there was one of the pararescue guys in the water greeting all the divers as they came out, and he just looked at me and he said, 4 out of 4, Doc. And I assumed he meant what I'd been thinking. And I went, oh, well, I guess I expected that. He said, no, mate, 4 out of 4, they're all alive. I went, what?
Wow, that's sending chills down my arms. Wow.
And then I went, oh, shit, now we've got to do it again tomorrow and the next day. And I was so scared that night, thinking about, I don't know how this has worked today, but tomorrow I just convinced myself that, it's all going to come unravelled, and it's going to be so much worse when they die tomorrow, because now we've set these expectations and people will start to say, well, what have you done wrong if they survived yesterday? I don't know, I got myself a bit worked up that night.
How do you deal with that, the elation from that, but then the horror of thinking, right, these expectations are high now, we've got to deliver tomorrow, it's probably not going to be, something's going to happen. Do you just go back and just stay focused and stay in the moment in the game, or were there moments of where you could have crumbled?
Yeah, I've found during my career of doing difficult things that I'm all right once I'm back into it. If I'm at the coalface, I'm working, okay, well, this is my next patient. This boy is my next patient. I give him 110% of my attention and my care. Send him off with the British guy. Don't think about the waiting room full of kids up there at the top of the cave, and don't think about anything outside the cave. Just do your best is all I can do for these boys. It's when it's finished that I, sometimes get a bit wobbly afterwards when you think about it, but I think that's normal.
So day 2, 4 boys again? How does it work? So you've got 4 out of 4 so far. There's what, 9 left in the cave at this stage?
Yep. So did another 4 the next day. And what I noticed the next day was that actually everything was a bit smoother, everything was a bit slicker, we got a bit faster. The kids all came out a bit more quickly out of the cave, which is obviously good, less anaesthetic, less side effects, all that sort of stuff. So when I got out at the end of the day, on the second day, to find that they'd all survived again, that's when I started to think there's actually room for some optimism here that, maybe this is actually going to work. And the third day I did feel more relaxed, although very, very tired by that stage, because we'd been running on only 2 or 3 hours sleep a night and, late night meetings every night.
Of course.
So it was pretty full on, but, you just get through it. It's only a few days. One story that I haven't spoken about very often was that on the first rescue day, we all felt really crook going into the cave. I was swimming along and I was feeling like I had the flu. I was shivery and I felt really weak. And I said that to Craig as I passed him at the far end of the cave, and he said, that's weird, I've got a headache. I never get headaches. When we all came out at the end of the day, those stories started going around the group and everyone was the same. And it turned out that the filters that they'd been filling the cylinders had not been changed, and we're all breathing probably a bit of carbon monoxide or a bit of hydrocarbon. So we could have wiped out the whole rescue team on the first day, which would not have been cool. But the second day, and I was really worried because I was thinking, bloody hell, I'm not up to this. I don't think I can do this for a couple more days. I feel terrible. Mm-hmm. I was really questioning my fitness. And anyway, the next day, breathing fresh air, when they fixed it all, I thought, right, I'm back.
So, you were like on top form. You're like, this is easy. No, never an easy task when it comes to rescues for sure. But so it gets second day, another 4, you say. So that's 8 out of 8. Any, like you said with Craig, was there any close calls where they looked like that they were dead, or anyone was twitching in the water before you had any of the air pockets? Were there any sort of critical moments like that people really had to jump into action? Yeah,
there were a few. And this was dealt with really by the guys, the British guys, because I was still at the far end of the cave each day until the end of the day, so I didn't see most of this. But that first kid I referred to was the 4th one out on the first day, and a couple of the kids had clearly had started to get some respiratory infections, and that always makes anaesthesia in children more difficult. They hold their breath, or they get spasm of their airway, or all sorts of other sort of airway related complications. So I was a bit worried about this little kid, and Rick Stanton was the last person that day. He took this boy out, and as he went down the tunnel on the surface of the water down to the end of the first tunnel, it was about a 100-metre swim before he went under the rock. He yelled back to me and said, "Oh, Harry, I'm a bit worried about this boy. He's barely breathing." And I said, "Well, we'll just time it. Just call out each time he takes a breath." So I sat there for a minute, and he only took 3 breaths in that minute. And Rick said, "What shall I do? Shall I come back?" And I said, "No, as we talked about, there's nothing you can do. You just keep going, and I'm going to get my gear on and come after you as quickly as possible, and I'll see you at the next air chamber." So I raced through, and I remember as I was coming through, eyes closed because of the opacity of the water, and my hand on the rope and the other hand stretched out in front of me, and suddenly I felt what felt like a dead fish in the water, and I realised it was a human foot of this little boy. And I thought, oh no, something's happened underwater, and this kid's died, and Rick's either left him or he's just ahead of him still. And then a moment later, my head popped out of the water, and I realised, oh, okay, we're actually at the start of the next dry chamber. And Rick and Craig were there saying, "Oh, there's something wrong with this kid." And I said, "Well, drag him up the beach. I'll get my gear off and I'll come and have a look." And this was the boy that was turning blue, basically. He just wasn't breathing. And so we pulled his face mask off, and I was just about to give him mouth to mouth, and I just did a bit of a jaw thrust, to open his airway. And that's quite a painful manoeuvre if you're at all conscious. And that was enough to actually make him take a breath. And within a couple of minutes, he was actually starting to thrash around to the point where he needed more anaesthetic. And that's the way this kid cycled all the way out through the cave. And so poor old Rick had a pretty stressful time with him. So, those sorts of stories, there were events like that for over the few days. And a couple of the divers also had a bit of exciting times in some of the restricted parts of the cave, trying to get themselves and the kid through as well.
The next day, you're hopefully going to get everyone out. Is that correct?
Yes, but we've got 5 to do, of course. The coach has to come out as well. And I had tried to encourage the Navy SEALs to bring the coach out with them. I was trying to get out of any of these anaesthetics that I could. And once the coach had seen the boys go out, he said, "No, I want what they're having." So we knew we had to do 5, and we only had 4 of these masks that seemed to work. And, the size was right. They had a positive pressure function, which was obviously helping with keeping the water out of the mask. And so we had to scrabble to find a 5th mask for the coach. And so we found 2 other options. One was an old-fashioned mask that was quite wide, quite big. Certainly wouldn't have fitted the boys, but maybe would fit the coach. And the second one was a little plastic pink recreational full face mask with a soft silicon seal, which we were a bit sort of dubious about, and neither of them had this positive pressure attribute. So anyway, I start work on the 3rd day. The first kid comes down, he's sitting on my lap. I'm just about to inject him, and I suddenly realise it's the coach, not one of the boys, because, they're all the same size. The coach is 60 kilos. The biggest boy was actually 65, and they've got a hood on by the time I see them. So I hadn't noticed a couple of little hairs on his chin there. And I thought this would be... one of the boys, not the coach. But anyway, it doesn't matter. Off we go. And I sort of forgot about the fact that I needed one of the biggest kids to come last because of this other mask. And so when I called for the 5th and final kid on that day, I was horrified to see this tiny, tiny little boy come down the slope. His name was Mark, and he was the smallest kid. He was 29 kilos. And I just went, oh, shit, we've got a big problem here. Like, none of these masks are going to work. And I was with the last British diver, Jason Mallinson, very tough little Yorkshireman. And I thought, well, it's probably good that it's Jason that's got this one because, if anyone can get him out, it's Jason. And so we tried I put him off to sleep because as soon as he hits the water, he's starting to shiver and, the clock's ticking. And tried the big mask, and it was literally 1.5 times too wide for his face, so that was never going to fly. And so we put on this little pink thing, and we just couldn't get it to seal. You know, it was collapsing on his face. We were trying to build up the size of his head by putting foam underneath his hood and just to make his face bigger. In the end, after about 10 minutes of mucking around, I just said to Jason, I'm sorry, mate, you're just going to have to go. This kid's getting too cold. We can't take him out and start again. We can't come back tomorrow because the monsoons were predicted to come back the next day. So we had to leave that day. And so Jason took this child out and literally, I think, held his face in his hand the whole way out for, 2 kilometres all the way out, just treated him like this tiny, precious cargo and somehow got him out alive. It was an extraordinary bit of diving.
Wow. When you think of things, so the temperature of the water, these kids are already, deteriorating rapidly, if not, close to knocking on death's door. How hard was it to make those decisions, or was it quite easy because it was literally a case of life and death?
I think if there's one thing I'm proud of for my own part in this is the fact that I did find the courage to just say, yeah, let's give this a crack, even though I was convinced that most of these kids would die, if not all of them. But it just came back to this basic premise of, what are my options? Leave these kids to die a horrible death, or perhaps offer them a kind death in their sleep, but they'll be reunited with their parents. So that just seemed like a no-brainer to me. And if there was some kind of fluke and any of them came out alive, well, that'll just be a bonus. I didn't probably think through the implications for myself, and I'm glad I didn't stop to think about all that in terms of my future career, my reputation, what the newspapers would have said about it. And I think that's pretty crystal clear to me now. What you can picture those headlines. So I was probably in some ways a bit stupid or naive. And the thing that maybe disturbed me for a few weeks after this whole event was I started to think, well, what kind of person would actually do that? What kind of person would take that risk on behalf of other people? I just felt like, did I have the right to actually put those kids at that risk? But, everything worked out. So, yeah, everything worked out.
Absolutely. And desperate times require desperate solutions. And that was the only solution that was on the table. Having had the team around you, you have 100% success rate. You come out of it. What goes through your head once all the kids are safe, your team is out, you're there? What goes through your head?
Yeah, well, when we came out that night and I found out that everyone was fine, the kids were all in hospital, there was this, incredible sense of relief, of course. And I remember us, the divers and the Navy SEALs, standing around in Chamber 3 at the end of that day. And we're just sort of having this time for ourselves before we have to go out into the limelight. And everyone's just standing around with these dumb smiles on their face. No one's speaking. There's nothing to say, really. It's just like we're all just looking at each other and smiling. And then someone pulled out a bottle of Jack Daniels and we're just passing that around for a little tipple. And, it was quiet, really quiet. And then someone said, shit, the Navy SEALs have still got to come out. So we suddenly thought, oh, okay, we better keep paying attention because we've got these other divers still to come out. And they weren't really experienced in the cave. So they were still, in some danger. And then we started to drift out of the cave, and that's when kind of all hell broke loose. One of the pumps suddenly failed, and the rains had been building. Like, we were quite nervous about the third and final day because the monsoon had started to fire up a bit. And these pumps all failed, and the water levels in that Chamber 3 suddenly started to rise. So there's this mad dash for the exit.
Every man for himself.
Yeah, it was a bit like that. So it was kind of funny at the end. There was this mad panic. But anyway, all's well that ends well.
Mate, what a selfless operation. And, the purpose and the focus once you saw those children, just is absolutely phenomenal. You come out of there, I remember it really well. You come out of there, the kids are all fine, they've been rescued. You're now heroes, and rightly so. Again, I know you're very humble and you say, I was just doing my job, but that wasn't. That was something extraordinary. You took on personal risk, you took on personal responsibility, which you mentioned before, which, if things could have gone wrong, could have been a completely different outcome. It could have affected you emotionally, psychologically, completely different as well. How does it make you feel?
Oh, immensely proud to have been a part of that kind of global collaboration. You know, when does anyone get an opportunity to be part of something like that? And Craig and I were busting to get there because we thought of it as a great adventure. Obviously, when we got there, we realised it was, but it was also a massive worry and a responsibility. Yeah. But then having left and to feel that sense of camaraderie with all those people that you were working shoulder to shoulder with for that one clear and common purpose, it was, I'm sure, the most satisfying thing that I'll ever do in my life. And I'm actually really grateful that I was there and that I was a part of it.
Harry, you were certainly put on this earth to save lives. You're absolutely phenomenal. And it's been an absolute pleasure having you here. The mindset that you have is just out of this world. And for those listening, will definitely take something from it. Keep being you, Harry. Keep saving lives. And thank you ever so much for coming on Head Game.
Thanks, Ant. I've really enjoyed chatting.
Thanks so much for joining me on Head Game. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any of our incredible stories, and leave me a review wherever you're listening. I'm Ant Middleton. Catch you again next time.